Today's daf, we're going to go a little quick because some of us are exhausted and etc. In Masechet Avodah Zarah is daf Memvav, daf 46. And we are up to um, on top of daf Memvav Amud Aleph. When we keep 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9 lines from the top. Hani Tana Kamei Rav Sheshet. So around 9 lines from the top, we're talking about, to give some background, we're talking about the Mishnah, which we learned yesterday, which basically said that if a non-Jew, maybe also a Jew, but a non-Jew for sure, who worships a mountain or a hill or a tree, does not make that thing prohibited. Because you're allowed to, you can prohibit an object of Avodah Zarah, but not attached, not something that's mechubar, because it has to be something that you can make through human intervention and not things that are natural. And we had a whole discussion yesterday about what about trees, because trees are natural, but they are made by humans if they plant them. So everyone agreed that if you plant a tree to be Avodah Zarah, it's prohibited. But if it's already planted, then there was a machloket about whether if you then worship it, what grows afterwards is prohibited, or if you can't answer. Now,
the orange cutting board.
James, I think you're
Those
not.
are all part.
James, you probably want to mute.
Sorry.
No worries. Tani Tana Kamei Rav Sheshet. Now, Tana said in front of, we don't know the name, but Tana said in front of Rav Sheshet the following Braita. The Braita says, Hagoyim, or Ovdei Kochavim, Ovdim et Haharim et Hagvaot. If a non-Jew worships a mountain or a hill, Hein Mutarim. The hill is mutar, because you can't prohibit it as Avodah Zarah, but Ovdeim B'Sayev. But the non-Jew, because remember, a non-Jew is chayev for 7 mitzvot, and one of them is Avodah Zarah, the non-Jew would be chayiv to be killed with saif because he did worship an idol. It's because it's very tricky. Rashi talked about it yesterday in the Mishnah about how you can be worshiping an idol if it's not an idol, right? You say you can't make the mountain into an idol, but if you bow down to it, you get killed. So anyways, that's an interesting discussion. Rashi says it's just a specific halacha, but there's a lot of discussion about that. But that's the first part of the Braita. Continues the Braita that hazraim bet hayirakot, if you bow down to grasses or vegetables, then hein asurin v'ovdeim b'sayev. Then they become asur. If you bow down, if a non-Jew bows down to the cucumbers, then not only does he get killed, but the cucumbers are prohibited to eat. So this seems to be unlike what we just said, that the tree would be permitted. So Amar Le, so Rav Sheshet said to this Tana, who said this thing in front of him, the Amar Lach money. Now, who is that Braita going according to? It seems like it's Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, who we had a debate yesterday. The Amar Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda said yesterday that Ilan Shennato L'Besof Avado Asur. That if you have a tree that was planted, right, and after it's planted, so when it's planted, you know, the initial thing, if you bow down to it, you can't prohibit a tree, just like you can't prohibit a mountain. But if you then worship it, and then it grows after you worship it, it becomes usher from the time you worship it. So that must be the same case of the vegetables, that basically someone planted vegetables, you then bow down to them and worship them. Then the cucumbers grew. The cucumbers are prohibited according to Rabbi Yossi Bar Yehuda. Says, well, if that's the case, so it says, well, how do you? Maybe that's not the case. Maybe it's talking about a case where you actually planted the vegetables in order for them to be Avodah Zarah. So meaning you didn't plant them initially for benign uses and then change them. Maybe you planted them initially for this. So if it looked me, why don't you just say, and Rashi changes the girsa here. Rashi, if you look, says, don't say Ilan, say Yirakot, because that's the case of the Braita. Look may be Yirakot, shenatu mitchila lekach. How do you know it's going according to Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda from yesterday? And it's only according to him that if you plant something and then worship it, what grows afterwards is prohibited. Maybe it's talking about a case where you planted it initially in order to worship it, which everyone agreed is prohibited. The Rabbanan. It's going even according to the Rabbanan. Says well, it doesn't seem very logical because the case in the Braita was that there was a mountain and a gvaot in the Reisha of the Braita, and then the Yurakot. But just like a mountain, no one plants a mountain, right? You cannot make a mountain. So a mountain cannot be something that you created in order to worship. So too, so here too, we presume it's a case where you didn't initially plant it in order for it to be usher, but after you planted it, you worshipped it. And according to the opinion we had yesterday, Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda, which we said in the Mishnah was also the opinion of Rabbi Yossi Haglili, is that would be prohibited from the time that you worshipped it. So that is how you understand the bright. Now, Itmar continues the Gemara now again, now 15 lines from the top, middle of the line. What about the case? So we established from the Mishnah that if a non-Jew bows down to a mountain and worships the mountain is not prohibited, right? So you can basically grow things on the mountain, you can use the mountain, you can climb the mountain. But what about Avnei Har Shenidal Delu? What if the stones of the mountain got separated, meaning they fell off the mountain? Big rock falls off the mountain, and everyone comes to this rock and says, we now worship this rock. This rock is the messenger from the mountain. So basically, they worship the rock when it's already separated from the mountain. So is that considered to be a permanent thing, essentially? Or the fact that it already broke off the mountain makes it a stone, like anything else? So what about Avnei Har, which some say, are big stones on the mountain that fell off? So Bnei Rabbi Chia of Rabbi Yochanan, there was a machlokat between the sons of Rabbi Chia, we'll see who they were in a second, and Rabbi Yochanan. Chad Omer Asurot, Chad Omer Mutarot. One opinion, one group said that the stones are asur, meaning if someone bows down to those stones, they are considered avodah zarah, and nobody else can use those stones. And the other one says that they're mutar, just like the mountain doesn't become asur, the stones don't become asur. Now, says Gemara, let's read inside. My time at demanda amar mutarot. What's the reason that the stones would be mutar even though they were worshipped? Kahar, because they're just like the mountain. Mahar sheimbo tfisati de adamu mutar. Just like a mountain is not created by a person, and therefore a person cannot asur it. Afhani sheimbem tfisati de adam mutarim. These two were not made by a person. These fell naturally. They're created naturally, and so they're not considered to be a human intervention. Says Gemara, but that's not a great analogy because malahar shkem mechubar. Think about a mountain. A mountain is attached to the ground. A mountain is permanent. A stone that fell off a mountain is not any longer mechubar. So how could you say that just like a mountain is mutar, a boulder that fell off the mountain is mutar? Says Gemara, well, because clearly it has nothing to do with being connected. Because think about behima tochiach, right? An animal. If someone bows down to an animal, right? Now, the question is how we know this, but I'll explain in a second. If someone goes and bows down to an animal as an avodah zarah, they say, I want to worship this cow, and they bow down to that cow. The cow does not become prohibited for avodah zarah. And the way we know that is because the Torah says, don't take an animal that was nevad ba'avodah zarah and bring it as a karban. From the fact that the Torah says, don't bring it as a karban, it means that you can use it for anything else, right? You can't bring it for a karban, but you can put it in your cholent. So clearly, a behema is not prohibited if someone worships it. Now, behema is movable, right? Animals walk around. So clearly, the fact is that a behema is not made by humans, and therefore humans can't asur it. So too, you should say that by stones. Somewhere, yeah, but an animal's a little bit different. Animal's alive, right? A stone is not alive, so maybe the reason an animal is mutar is because it's a living thing, but a stone should be prohibited. Says Gemara, well, then har yivchiach. Right, then the mountain proves that wrong because the mountain's not alive and a mountain doesn't become prohibited. So Chazar Hadin, this is a very classic, limud in the Torah. You go back from one exception to the other exception. Lo re'izek re'izeh, the unique things about this case are not the same as that case. Lo re'izek re'izeh, hatzar hashava shebehen. What is the commonality between animals and mountains? She'ein behen tfisat yidei adam u'mutar, that they are not created by people, and therefore, if someone bows down to them, they remain mutar. Af kol she'ein ben tfisati de adam mutar. Therefore, I say, we don't know if it's Rabbi Yochanan or Bnei Rabbi Chia, but we say that the stone should be mutar. Says the Gemara, well, that's not a really good proof, because malit sanashava shemahan. You know what's common between an animal that's permitted and a mountain? Shekain lo nishtanu mi biryatan. They are both natural, meaning they were made this way by the world, by God, and that's how you found them, and they weren't changed. But a stone that fell off of a mountain, even if you didn't knock it off, it fell off, it's no longer where it started. So maybe a stone would be prohibited, unlike an animal and a mountain. So that's why you're right. A stone maybe would be a good example, except atya mi behema balatmu. But you can think of an example of an animal that has a balmum, right? An animal that was born and now has a balmum is no longer the same animal, quote unquote, that it was when it started, right? And the fact that it has a balmum changes it. But still, if someone bows down to that animal, it would be mutar, right? So you could then say from the behemat balat mum and the har that the shadat tzadashavav of the two of them is that humans did not make them, and therefore they're not prohibited, and so too by a boulder. Inami, or else the other example would be mi behemat tama ilan yavesh. Right, you can have a tree, or let's say not really a mountain, but a tree that withers, right? A tree that the branches are falling apart. And that clearly, quote unquote, is changed from how it started. And therefore, even though it changed, it's still permitted. You never find a Mishnah or a Gemara that says that an animal with a mum is prohibited, or a tree that's dried out is prohibited. And therefore, either, again, Rabbi Chia's sons or Rabbi Yochanan, one of them derived from that tzadashava that a boulder would be permitted. Uman asar. Now, what about the one who says that in fact it's prohibited? We're at the fourth to last of the narrow lines. That one says that opinion is the hachichtiv. Therefore, the pasuk says in V'etchanan, in this week's parsha, shaketz tishaktzenu v'taev titavenu. Make it into something really disgusting. You should really be, it should be to'iva to you. It should be disgusting to you, this avodah zarah. Meaning, that even in a case where you can find a reason to say something is mutar, be extra strict. And so anything that's not explicitly said in the Gemara or in the Psukim, you have to say is prohibited. And it only explicitly says in the Pasuk, the har, the mountain, or the animal, or the tree. It doesn't say a boulder. Since it doesn't say that, even though there is a tzara shaveh, you're not supposed to use it because the Torah wants you to make specific harchakot, distance from avodah zarah. And says the Gemara now, 2 lines in the last narrow line, to Stayim, it's logical to us that the opinion of the Bnei Rabbi Chia is Dishara. That in fact, remember we said, one was said by Rabbi Yochanan, one was said by the sons of Rabbi Chia, but it seems logical from another source, we'll see what the source is in a second, that it's the sons of Rabbi Chia who said that it's permitted to use this boulder that was worshipped. Because, remember, the sons of Rabbi Chia, if you recall, were Yehuda and Chizkiah, sons of Rabbi Chia. And in fact, there's a question from Chizkiah, the son of Rabbi Chia, the boy Chizkiah asked a very interesting question. What if you take an egg, right? Now, an egg seems to be something natural, right? People don't create eggs. They are laid by chickens or other animals. Let's say you take a zakaf pizza, you stand up an egg, which means pretty much, instead of, living on the ground, you put it on a pedestal, you stand it up, you make a sign, and you say, we're going to worship the egg, to bow down to it. Mahu, does that make the egg prohibited after they bow down to it? Now, before we answer the question, we think what it means is that Chizkiah asked the question, Chizkiah, the son of Rabbi Chia, if you set up the egg to bow down to it, and you actually bow down to it. So the guy worshiped this egg. And the question is, Zikifata, setting it up on a pedestal, which Zikifa literally means setting it up, is that considered to be an action that changes it or is not an action? Aval, the assumption in Chizkiah's question is, lo zakaf, if you hadn't set the egg up on a pedestal, you hadn't set it up straight, and the non-Jew just worshiped the egg on the ground or wherever it was, then everyone would agree, lo mitzvah, the egg is not prohibited. Now, an egg seems to be a lot like a boulder that fell off a mountain, right? Because although it's natural, it moved out of its original place. And Shema Mina, you see from here, B'nei Rabbi Chia D'Sharo, that the fact that Chizkiah only asked a question about an egg that had to be set up and something was done to it, and the question is that action enough to make it something that can be prohibited? It implies that in its natural state, it wouldn't be prohibited. So that seems to be very similar to the boulder, and that must be that the sons of Rabbi Chia, at least Chizkiah, but they were a pair, agree that the boulder would be permitted. So that's really not an exact example. Because I don't know where I am. We are third wide line. Look, it's not really a perfect analogy. Because the Olam Malacha, I can always tell you that Bnei Rabbi Chia da Asri. Bnei Rabbi Chia would prohibit it, right? A boulder that fell off a mountain. If it was worshipped, it becomes an avodah zarah, or it becomes prohibited for worship of avodah zarah. But the case by the egg is dehishtachavela. If the person actually bowed down to this egg, dehishtachavela, so I'm going to read it. If the person bowed down to the egg, right, bach adds a vav, right, dehishtachavela, Afal gavdalo zakva asura. That in fact, if you bow down to an egg that was sitting on the ground, it would be just like a boulder and would be prohibited. But why are they asking a question about if you set it up on a pedestal? The question here is related to where you didn't bow down to it. You go on, they make a big ceremony. This egg, this ostrich egg, is really special and important, and we're going to worship it. And they make a sign in a temple and they put it up on the pedestal, but they don't end up bowing down to it. They don't get a chance to actually worship it. And the question here is preparing something for Avodah Zarah the same as worshiping it as Avodah Zarah? This is Leman. Now, who's this going according to? Ilaman Damar Avodah Zarah Yisrael Asura Miyad Asura. Right? If it's going according to the opinion that Avodah Zarah of the Yisrael, which is a debate we've had before, we're going to have more later, that if the Yisrael says, I'm going to worship this thing, then it becomes Asur even before they worship it. Then it should be Asura. So then the egg should be Asur. Now, if it's going according to the person who says that it doesn't become Asur until you worship it, then here you didn't worship it. Halu pocha. So what's Chizkiya's question? Now, the case is the following. A Jew found this beautiful egg and said, I'm going to turn this into an idol, and they set it up to worship. But they didn't worship it. He didn't worship it for whatever reason, right? It didn't end up happening. Uba oved kochavim v'ishtachavela, and a non-Jew comes and bows down to it. So now this is all the question of Rabbi Chia. Does the non-Jew coming to bow down to it make a difference? Again, the Bach adds a vav now. This is very similar to the case of Rabbi Yehuda Amar Shmuel, who asked the following question: Yisrael shezakaf leveina. A Jew, now unfortunately, decides to worship this. Levena usually means like a brick, like a thing that's made, a construction thing, basically. So you take a levena, a brick out of mortar, out of whatever we make bricks out of, and he takes these bricks and he sets them up to be the idol. So he takes, I don't know, a bunch of bricks and puts them up and says, this is going to be, or even one, this is going to be the symbol that we worship. And he doesn't worship it though. Uba ovekochavim mishtachavela, and then a non-Jew comes and bows down to it. Asura, it is asur, because even though the Yisrael didn't end up bowing down to it, the fact that the Yisrael, wanted it to be Avodah Zarah and somebody else worshipped it Avodah Zarah makes it asur. And the question that Chizkiya asked here, Kamibayle, was, is that only leveinahu deminkra zekifata? Is that only a levena, a brick? Because you can tell that when you set it up, basically, this is how Rashi understands it, that you can, when you set up a brick, it's a common thing, or it's set up in a specific way that's worshipped. And so everyone knows that the Jew set up for worship, and therefore would become asur when the guy worshipped it. Beitza, low, but maybe an egg, which is not a common thing to be worshipped as much, maybe an egg, because again, it's usually you would make avodah zarah out of, Rashi points out, out of construction things, right? You would take metal or stone or wood that's cut down. You wouldn't take living things like an egg. So an egg, which is an unusual thing to use, maybe it's not considered to be an avodah zarah because the Yisrael didn't bow down to it. Odoma loshna, or maybe it's no different. And teko. So that we don't resolve. But basically, the question of Chizkiya did not revolve around whether a non-Jew who bows down to a living thing or a organic thing, I'll call it, prohibits the thing or not. Here, this question was very specific about a Jew designated it as an avodah zarah, and the question was, he didn't yet worship it, but if a non-Jew worshipped it, does that make it into an avodah zarah or not? And that's what they weren't sure about.
It's temporary, right? It's temporary. Suppose in the meantime, he wants to designate this, and the egg cracks open and the chicken or something comes out of that egg. Then what's the status then?
I don't know. That's a really good question. I'm not really sure. I would imagine, remember we had the cases before where the avodah zarah fell down. Maybe it's a little similar, right? If it cracks open, maybe that's a proof that it's not so powerful. But I think the case here is where he wanted to worship the egg. So I guess if it's not an egg, it's no longer things to worship. But I don't know, I guess the more complicated part of your question, which is a great question, is what if a person worshiped the egg and then the egg cracked open, right? So the egg became prohibited. But now the chicken inside, I don't know if that's prohibited. I don't know if the pieces of the egg pieces of egg probably are prohibited, but I'm not really sure. So
Well, the chicken now, is the chicken prohibited? Can he eat the chicken?
it's a good question. I'm trying to think. I don't know. I don't know the answer. I mean, we're gonna have a case later today, I think. I'm not sure if we're gonna get there, where you bow down to a animal that's pregnant, right? What happens to the ubar that comes out of that animal? So I guess the chicken is very similar to what comes out of the animal, even though it's not really dependent on the animal. But I guess the chicken, we're gonna say later that the animal is asur. So the chicken probably would be asur because it's part of the egg. But I don't know for sure. Let's continue at the two dots at the bottom, last line of Mem Vav Amud Aleph. Boy Rami Rachama. Rami Rachama asked the following question, right? We said in our Mishnah that if a person bows down to a mountain, right, that does not prohibit the mountain from being used to make your street or build your house, because you cannot prohibit a mountain. But what about using it in the Beit HaMikdash? Remember, the rules in the Beit HaMikdash are different than the regular rules. And the classic example is an animal. Right? If a person bows down to an animal, that animal does not become prohibited as Avodah Zarah. And you can shecht it and eat it if it's your animal. But it becomes prohibited to the Mizbeach. The Torah very specifically says, Lo tavi etnan zonah u'mechir kelev. That's the wrong pasuk. We're going to get into that pasuk. The pasuk says, don't bring an animal that was worshipped as Avodah Zarah to Hashem. Right? So it also says that about etnan and mechir, which we'll get to, which is why I quoted it, but that's not the quite right pasuk yet. So the question is, what if you bow down to a non-Jew, say, bows down to a mountain? The mountain's not prohibited for regular use, but avanav mahulim mizbeach. Can you take those stones and use them in the Beit HaMikdash on the mizbeach, or is that like a karban? Right? Remember, if a person bows down to an animal, you can't bring the animal as a karban. So how do you view the mountain? So ask the Gemara now on Daf Mem Vav Amud Bet. Let's elaborate on the question. Yesh ne'avad b'mechubar etzel gavoa, or ein ne'avad b'mechubar etzel gavoa. Something which is attached, unlike an animal, something which is attached to the ground, can it even be said that you worshipped it so that it becomes prohibited or not? That's one question. Etzel gavoa meaning in the Beit HaMikdash. And even imtim salomar yesh ne'avad b'mechubar etzel gavoa, even if you say that in terms of the Beit HaMikdash, worshiping something that's even attached is considered to be worshiping it, but bringing it on the as a mizbeach is not the same as bringing it as a carbon, right? You can't bring a carbon from stones. There's no stone carbons, but you can bring a stone as a mizbeach. So the question is, machshirei carbon ki carbon damo. Are things that are brought with the carbon, meaning in this case the mizbeach, where you burn the carbon, is that considered to be a problem or not? The Torah maybe only says don't bring an animal, but maybe bringing wood, let's say, or stones in this case would not be a problem. So that was the question that Rami Bar Chama asked, right? Rami Bar Chama, yeah. So Amar Rava said, Rava, well, it's a kal v'chomer, because if you look at the case of Etnan, right? Says Rava kal v'chomer. My Etnan, remember, Etnan is an animal that's given in payment for prostitution or something, illicit. So the Torah says explicitly that if a person is given an animal in payment for prostitution, they can't then bring that animal on the mizbeach, right? Lo tavi etnan zonah beit Hashem elokech, right? Don't bring an etnan zonah to Hashem's house. So now, but having said that, it's prohibited in the Beit HaMikdash, but there's no problem with eating that animal, right? If it's a kosher animal and you shecht it, there's no prohibition in eating an animal that was paid for a prostitute for her work, or right? So it says Rava Tzekal v'chom, ma etnan. Think about an animal that's given for etnan. That is mutar b'talush lahedyo, right? It is mutar to a hedyo b'talush, meaning by definition almost, it's detached from the ground because it's an animal. It's permitted b'talush lahedyo, right? However, asur b'mechubar legavoa. Even if it was mechubar, Rashi says, you could pay etnan with something on the ground, right? You could pay an etnan with a tree and say, in exchange for your services, I'll give you this tree, right? But or a hill or whatever. But that would be asur legavoa, even though it's still mechubar, and because it was given as an etnan, it's prohibited to the Beit HaMikdash. How do I know that? Because the pasuk says, "Lo tavi etnan zonah mechir kelev Beit Hashem elokecha." Rashi understands it comes from the word beit, that says, don't bring it to the house, implying not just as a karban, but don't even bring it as a gift to Hashem, basically. And we learn from there, lo shna talush, lo shna mechubar. Torah does not differentiate between whether the payment someone gave the zonah was something mechubar, attached to the ground, or something that was talush. So an etnan, which is permitted even if it's talush, to a regular person is prohibited even if it's mechubar to the Beit HaMikdash. So a ne'evad, so an animal, let's say, that was separated from the ground, that was worshipped, or not an animal that was killed, or a plant that was turned into flour, to asur b'talush lahedyot. If you worship something that's not attached to the ground, right, it's no longer alive, it becomes prohibited to a hedyot like any other avodah zarah. So eno din shasur b'mechubar legavoah. Shouldn't you for sure take it the next level and say, if it's prohibited to a regular person when it's detached, it would be prohibited to the Beit HaMikdash even when it's mechubar. And so that's how I know that if you bow down to a hill, you can't take the stones from the hill and bring it as a mizbeach. Amalei Rafuna Breit of Yeshua, the Rava now, Rafuna Breit of Yeshua, heard Rava say this, and he said back to him, I can tell you the exact opposite conclusion. Oh, chiluf. I can tell you the exact opposite kal v'chomer, which is the following. Ma ne'evad, now take the opposite assumptions, right? An animal that's ne'evad, or not just an animal, an object that is worshipped for avodah zarah, is for sure asur b'talush etzel hedyot. It's for sure prohibited for a hedyot to use that thing, and it's prohibited to bring it to the Beit HaMikdash. But it's mutar b'mechubar legavoah. But if a person worships something attached to the ground, like a hill or a tree, it's mutar even to bring it to the Beit HaMikdash. Shenemar, it says Eloheihem al haharim, as we said yesterday. The gods, the idols are on the mountains, but the mountains are not the idols. Lo harim Eloheihem. And the Torah doesn't differentiate. Lo shna hedyot, lo shnam legavoah. It doesn't say this is true for a hedyot and not true for the Beit HaMikdash. So says Rabbi Huna Breder Yeshua, my starting point is that by a worshipped object, it's prohibited if it's detached to a hedyot, but it's prohibited, of course, to the mizbeach, but it's permitted to Hashem if it's attached when it was worshipped. So therefore, etnan, now you get to the case of something given in exchange for prostitution, mutar b'talush lahedyot, where it's mutar for a hedyot to even use it, even if it's a worship, given, not worship, but given in exchange, certainly an etnan should be mutar legavoah. So you're going to say, what about the pasuk? Imisham Beit Hashem Elokecha. Torah says Beit Hashem Elokecha, meaning don't bring your etnan or your mechir kelev to Hashem's house. And we said before that implies even whether it's mechubar, whether it's talush, whether you're using it or not. Says Rav. Again, what's the name here? Says Rafuna Breder of Yeshua. That pasuk is for something else. I actually use that for the following Breita, which the Breita says, Beit Hashem Elokecha. Why does it say don't bring an etnan to Hashem's house? That's telling you prat lepara. In fact, you don't have an exclusion of a para aduma as a etnan sheino balabayit, because a para aduma does not come to the Beit HaMikdash. Different Rebbe Eliezer. It's only things that are brought into the Beit HaMikdash. Remember, para aduma was not shechted in the Beit HaMikdash. It was shechted across the way in the Achal Kidron and in the Har Zeitim area. So since it was not brought into the Beit HaMikdash, it doesn't have the same prohibition. Or Chachamim say a different exclusion, the Rabotat HaRikuim. It's actually to not exclude, but to include things Rikuim, meaning which is metal, the gold that they would have as plates on the Beit HaMikdash. That also cannot become from Etnan. But either way, the pasuk is not extra. So that was the question of Rafuna Breder of Yeshua to Rava. How Rava can you make a kal v'chomer that it should be prohibited? I have the opposite kal v'chomer that it should be permitted. And Rava said back to Rami Barcham I keep saying that. Rafuna Breder of Yeshua, Amalei. So what? We have two kal v'chomers. One is there's no way to say one is better than the other. Ana kamina l'chumra. So it says Rava, my kal v'chomer says that it's more chamor, that it's prohibited. At amr l'kula. Your kal v'chomer says it's permitted. The principle we have is kula v'chomer l'chomer parchinan. If you have a kal v'chomer that's, again, without proof that one is right or the other is right, if one is machmir and one is mekel, you go with the one that's a chumrah. So that's why I say my opinion. Amalei Rav Papa the Rava. Now said Rav Papa to Rava. This is a little bit of a tangent, but it says Rav Papa to Rava. We're around halfway down. First word on the line. Amalei. Rav Papa said to Rava, is that really true? Is it true that when you have one kal v'chomer that says it should be permitted, and one kal v'chomer that says it should be prohibited, that you always say the kal v'chomer that it's prohibited? What about the famous case that we had? This was, if you recall, a complicated Mishnah in Masechet Psachim. The reason it was complicated was the case in Masechet Psachim was where you had someone who was tameh, right? If a person is tamei mate and Pesach comes around, you don't do the carbon Pesach, you go Pesach Sheni, right? You're permitted, you're prohibited actually, but you don't have a responsibility to do the Pesach. Now, this guy or woman became tamei mate 7 days before Pesach. So you figure this is great. On the 7th day, which is Erev Pesach, they'll become tahor because they get haza'ah on the 3rd day and the 7th day, and then they can eat the carbon Pesach at night. And we had a whole discussion. You could bring the carbon Pesach for them, even though they're tamei, because at night they'll be tahor. So it seems great. The only problem is that Erev Pesach that year was Shabbos. And the rule we have is that you don't sprinkle blood, not blood, you don't sprinkle the water on someone on Shabbos. It's an Isser Drabanan. What's the Isser? Is that Haza'ah is like machshir, right? It's like going to the mikvah almost. It's like you're fulfilling the final thing and making the person tahor. So you don't do that on Shabbos, okay? So that's a debate. Do you do it on Shabbos or not do it on Shabbos, right? If you do it on Shabbos, then this person has to do it and they have to eat the carbon Pesach, right? So that's a chiyuv. If they don't do it on Shabbos, then they're tamei because they can't become tahor, and then they don't bring the carbon Pesach bismano. So that's the kula. And it's a machloket between Rabbi Akiva and Rabbi Ishmael, or Rabbi Eliezer, sorry, in the Mishnah and Masechet Pesachim. And if you go now, let's read now inside. Haza'ah de Pesach, the question of doing haza'ah on a person on Shabbos, that's Erev Pesach, to make them allowed to bring the carbon Pesach, there it's a machloket, pligi Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Eliezer savar l'chumra. Rabbi Eliezer says that you make a kal v'chomer. Again, I'm not going to go through it too much, but the kal v'chomer goes from the shchita. Remember, you're allowed to do shchita on Shabbos to shech the carbon Pesach. So Rabbi Eliezer says, well, if you could do shchita, which is an Isser Doraita, for sure you can do haza'ah, which is an Isser Drabanan, right? And anyways, Rabbi Akiva speaks back to him and says, you don't have to do it. So Rabbi Eliezer said it's the chumrah and kamechayev legavra, and the person has to do it and bring the carbon Pesach. And Rabbi Akiva says lekula upater, right? Rabbi Akiva says, oh, you don't have to do haza'ah, and you're pater from doing the carbon Pesach, which is a kula, and kaparach Rabbi Akiva lekula. Rabbi Akiva says to Rabbi Eliezer, I have a different kal v'chomer. So you see that you sometimes make a kal v'chomer lekula, even when there's another kal v'chomer lechumra. It's not. Now we're going to quote from the Mishnah in Pesachim. The Mishnah says, Heshiv Rabbi Akiva. Rabbi Akiva answered Rabbi Eliezer, who made the kal v'chomer that I just spoke out. If on Shabbos you can do shchita, which is an Isser Doraita, for sure on Shabbos you can do haza'ah, which is an Isser Drabanan. And Rabbi Akiva answered and said, O chiluf, maybe say the opposite. Uma haza'ah shemishum shvut eno docha Shabbat. Maybe in fact, haza'ah, which is only Isser Drabanan of shvut, is not docha Shabbat. That's the given. Maybe shchita she doraita lo kol shekain. So maybe shchita shouldn't be docha Shabbat. Now, again, we're not going to get into the argument there, but it seems clear that Rabbi Akiva is saying a kal v'chomer lekula when you could say a kal v'chomer lechumra. And Rava just said you don't do that. Answers the Gemara, you forgot the whole Gemara in Pesachim if you ask this question. Because Hatam, what happened there was, it wasn't that there was one kal v'chomer that Rabbi Eliezer had, and one kal v'chomer Rabbi Akiva had. Rabbi Akiva's kal v'chomer makes no sense, but he was just saying it because Rabbi Eliezer was wrong. Rabbi Eliezer had gotten old, had maybe not gotten old, but he was older, and he had forgotten what he taught them. And Rabbi Akiva was trying to remind him by saying this kal v'chomer, not based on the strength of the kal v'chomer, but based on the logic behind it. Because what happened there? Hatam Rabbi Eliezer Gamre. Rabbi Eliezer initially learned it the way Rabbi Akiva learned it, which is that you don't do haza'ah on Shabbos, right? V'iyakar le Talmuda. He forgot his learning. V'at Rabbi Akiva la'ad kure. And Rabbi Akiva was coming to remind him. And this is the quote now from the Mishnah in Pesachim. Rabbi, he was said to Rabbi Eliezer, Rabbi, al tichbareni b'shat hadin. Don't be kofar. Don't deny it against me when it comes to the time of din. Meaning, when we come to talk about this practically, don't say I'm wrong because kach mikubal ani mimcha. This is what we learned from you a long time ago, that haza'ah is shvut, that the prohibition of sprinkling blood on someone is a Isser Drabanan, but eino dochet Shabbat. It's not docha Shabbat, and therefore, if it's on Erev Shabbat, you don't be docha Shabbat to do it, and the person does not bring the carbon Pesach, and they push it off to Pesach Sheni. So that is not a proof about this question. So we're back to our original point that when you have two kal v'chomers, one the chumrah, one the kula, generally you go with the one that's the chumrah if there's no proof to do the other way. I'm trying to think if I should do a few more lines here. A few more lines, it's because it's really the beginning of a long sugya. I'm actually going to stop here. So because the next question, I know that Ken asked the question, which we're not going to get to today, about the next sugya, which we're going to stop here, 6 lines from the bottom or 7 lines from the bottom, is about what happens, what's a change, right? So we already said if you bow down to a mountain and the stone falls off it, it's not considered a change. If you carve a stone out of that mountain and shape it and make it into an idol, that's a change, right? The question we're going to discuss tomorrow, and more than that, is what actually counts as a change in this regard. And the example we're going to, of course, use is from menachot. If someone bows down to grain, to wheat, right, and so that wheat does not become asur, let's just say, but then you cut down the wheat and you grind it and you make it into flour and you bring it as a karban, presumably at that point it would become asur. That's the case we're going to discuss tomorrow. So we'll stop here. It'll be in a few hours tomorrow morning, I think. And hope everyone has a wonderful week. And we get to see Nechamat Zion. Shavua Tov.
Shavua Tov, good night.
Good night.